Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just seeing everybody who's here. I want to thank you all for being here for our last event in Humanities and Health Week. Today, Dr. Naomi Rosenberg joins us as part of the week. It's a week celebrating the intersections between the skills and capacities developed in humanities fields and the well-being mentally, physically, and spiritually, and even environmentally of human beings. So, Dr. Rosenberg is an assistant professor of clinical emergency medicine at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine, which is at Temple University. She leads with Dr. Douglas Reifler and Michael Vitez, Temple's narrative medicine program. The mission of the program is to focus on the human side of medicine, to increase the satisfaction and fulfillment of students and physicians, and to chronicle the amazing work of Temple University Hospital. They do this through the celebration of and emphasis on stories and storytelling. In addition to her clinical work, Dr. Rosenberg is a published author, and I'll single out here her powerful piece. This is how I first found her. Her powerful piece in 2016 in the New York Times opinion section, How to Tell a Mother Her Child is Dead. And she was also a Be Well Philly Health Hero semifinalist in 2020. Part of what fuels Dr. Rosenberg then is a passion for storytelling and narrative, and her belief in how they can improve and enhance clinical environments. I also want to take a moment to welcome Sister Carol Jean Vale, who graciously supported this event and the development of our Health Humanities minor at the college, and also to welcome sort of my partner in crime, Ken Soprano, in the biology department. So without these two other people, today could not have been possible. So thank you so much for your support. And now I am pleased to welcome Dr. Naomi Rosenberg, who will speak to us on the topic of what the language of medicine cannot capture, modern medicine and the need for narrative. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm Naomi Rosenberg. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me and for making this possible. This is a great joy for me, as I was an English major who now spends most of her time in the hospital. So getting to be back on a college campus as part of a humanities event is a real joy for me. As mentioned, I want to talk a little bit today about what the language of science cannot capture and how narrative fits into the world of modern medicine. By way of introduction, I went to University of Michigan, where I was an English major. I got to work for a group called Partners in Health, which is a global health nonprofit founded by Paul Farmer for several years. And then I came to Philadelphia to go to Penn for medical school, and then over to Temple for my training, and then I've stayed on as faculty. I've been there since 2013. In medicine or the hospital, we give our disclosures. These are financial relationships that might have an impact on what we're going to say here today. I have no financial disclosures. I study English. But in the spirit of it, in the spirit of anything that I might bring to this talk today and to my understanding of science and medicine and narrative, I'm a doctor, so I bring with it all the biases that come with being a doctor. I'm a doctor who's trained in emergency medicine, so I bring all of the particular biases of my specialty to the way that I think. I'm a woman as a doctor. We could go on, but those are the disclosures of the things that I bring with me to today's talk, and I'm just giving you one person's perspective on this issue. I'm also someone who was trained and in a lot of ways raised up by this man, Paul Farmer, who founded Partners in Health and is himself a writer, physician, anthropologist, and advocate. And he talked about how technical competence is the very least that we can offer our patients, meaning the very least they should expect for us is technical competence in our specialty, which is absolutely critical. I couldn't be an emergency medicine doctor who didn't know how to put in a chest tube or set a broken leg. But he argues, and I would agree, that that's the very bare minimum of what our patients can expect from us as we move through our medical training and become physicians. So why did I choose this topic? I was stopped in my tracks by this quote from My Own Country. Has anyone read that book? My Own Country. So Verghese writes, "The language of science could not begin to capture the phenomenon. The language of science could not begin to capture the heartache of the family, the tragic voyage of the patient, and my own grief at seeing this again and again. He's writing about the AIDS epidemic in the South, where he worked in the late 1980s and early 90s. And I read this book about him coming up as a trainee in Tennessee in the 80s and 90s, treating patients with AIDS in the early part of the epidemic. And I thought, this is just as relevant today as it is any time. And I work in the emergency department, so I don't come with light stories. I come with heavy stories, and I don't apologize for that. Our world is a heavy place sometimes. And so what is it that biochemistry, again, all of the fields critically needed, anatomy and physiology, what might we miss as we learn how to take care of patients if we were to only study the hard sciences, as we call them, the biology, the biochemistry? What might we miss in the voyage of the patient and the doctor? And that's really something I spend a lot of my time thinking about, and I'd like us to think about today. It sounds like you guys are thinking about it too. I saw the memorial that you have on the drive coming up. So you're thinking about the tragic voyage of the patient, the family, and the doctor with gun violence in our city and around the country. Certainly in the events of the last 19 months, we could think about the tragic voyage of the patient, the family, and the doctor as relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then also unique to where I live and work in Kensington is the opiate epidemic. And we could take any number of things, and we could think to ourselves, if we stuck straight to the biology, chemistry, and physiology, what might we miss in learning to take care of people and to be with them as they're healthy and as they're sick? So that's what I want us to think about as we frame our time together. So we're here, and I spend my time being a doctor, but also talking to the medical students, and some of whom really enjoy our time together reading Hemingway and James Baldwin, and some of whom would prefer not to be doing that. And we talk about why we're here together, and I think there's something that's fundamentally unchanged about being a doctor at the bedside of a sick patient. And this is obviously quite an old photograph of a doctor sitting at the bedside of a young child, getting ready to talk to their family, who's in the background. And I think there's something that's fundamentally unchanged about being with people when they're sick, scared, or hurting. I don't think that's changed at all. Medicine might change, and the scene might change, and the hospital setting. But I think that for those of us interested in healthcare, when we're doing it right, being with people when, again, they're sick, scared, or hurting is fundamentally unchanged. Now, why I'm here is because I'm a nerd. And so from the youngest age possible, all I wanted to do was read books. Now I treat patients. But I love to read, and I always have, and I've always been very moved by the stories of people as described to me by the great authors of various times. I'm also here because this could also have been used to describe me. You know, we could say I was someone who is sensitive or romantic, but sometimes going into the world, I might have felt like that, or other people might have seen me that way. And again, I don't think that's anything to apologize for. For those of us who are lucky enough to stand with people, if we can't understand how they might feel, if we can only bring our personal experiences to bear, we wouldn't do a very good job. So I think for those of us who have happened to have big feelings all along, or feel very deeply, or don't find it hard to relate to the pain of others, and the joy of others, I think that sometimes we might wonder where we fit in a system that might seem a little bit more crushing. So I think there's a few things. I think understanding narrative helps our patients, and I think it helps us. And again, I'm a doctor who sees patients, so that's what I'll speak as. And I'm not an athlete, but so I rarely use sports metaphors because I always miss them. But this is a woman who, after winning one of the tennis Grand Slam champions, they said, "How did you do it?" And she said, "I learned to hit every ball." And we talk about this a lot in medicine, in that, especially in a specialty like mine, where what might come in over the next 8 hours could be anything from a broken foot to a baby who's born, to a woman with belly pain, to someone who's shot through the chest. You really need to have an enormity of skills to be able to take care of that. And we spend a lot of our clinical training learning those clinical skills on how to take care of people. But I'd like to argue over the next few minutes that we need to learn to complete the analogy, we need to learn to hit every ball, which is we need to learn to be with people no matter where they are. And this is one part of medical training that for all of us who've been a patient, most of us have the experience of being a patient, not as many of being a healthcare provider, but for all of us as a patient, I imagine most of us have had an experience where the person walks into the room and they kind of miss the mark in terms of connecting with us and what's happening to us that day. And I think as patients, and our patients relate a lot to this sense, they feel like we're not listening. And we don't have to go very far to find information that people feel like doctors don't always listen. And I don't think they're wrong. I think it's really hard to listen, and I think it's hard to listen well, and I think it's hard to show somebody that you're listening. And we spend a fair bit of our time trying to teach people how to do that where I work. So what is every ball, and how do we learn to hit every ball? This is a quote from the book A Gentleman in Moscow, and he writes, "This is exactly how Napoleon must have appeared when in the hour before dawn he walked among his ranks, reviewing everything from the stores of munitions to the dress of the infantry, having learned from experience that victory on the field of battle begins with the shine on a boot." Making the point here that the very small details in preparation, and for any students here who are undergraduates, sometimes we do things and we don't exactly understand how they might fit into a career that we'd like to have down the road, which is hard for us to anticipate. But if we're prepping for every possible moment, which we not knowing what might come in, and paying attention to every detail and learning what we can from every single story, what might we learn as we move forward? I'm going to give a little bit of a grab bag of my experience in taking care of patients, because again, from my experience as being an undergraduate, you never know what really is going to move someone or cause them to think. And so for us, we face a lot of things, and we see a lot of things, and that's kind of how I'm going to just give a little grab bag of how this might be relevant, how it's been relevant in my life, and how maybe it would be relevant in your thinking. Has anyone seen this photograph, this intersection? So this is the intersection 2 blocks north of Temple Hospital on Broad Street. It's a bookstore, and the bookstore says we ship to prisons. I grew up in suburban Maryland, where the bookstores were did not advertise that as something. That was not the population that they were selling their books to. So I had and continue to have a lot to learn about the place where I am. And that's my job, to learn about the place where I am. But I learned very quickly that I was in a place so devastatingly affected by the mass incarceration in our country that the local bookstore needed to advertise that they were able to ship to prisons, so that young men and women in the neighborhood could get books from their families. So again, where I work, I learn about breaking bad news. As you mentioned, that's something I've written quite a bit about. It's something I teach and think quite a bit about. So why does story matter when we're breaking bad news? I would argue story is the only thing that matters. The medicine is often quite straightforward. So someone comes in, we take care of the injuries or illness that they have, and sometimes we aren't able to do that. And one of our big jobs is also helping people die. That's one of the things that we do in medicine, in some of the specialties in the hospital. So once someone dies, the medicine is over, or is it? Because next we have to break that news to the family. And anyone who's been in a hospital with someone who's sick or dying or has died knows that doctors carry a heavy load, and nurses communicating that information, and some do it well and some don't do it well. And when I was a student living in Philadelphia, I read a story in the Inquirer, and it talked about a young man who had died after a gunshot wound, and it said that he died at 5:42. His mothers and sisters were notified by the nightly news shortly after 8 p.m. in the hospital waiting room. Police are looking for a suspect. And I immediately knew what they meant, which is that the family was sitting in the waiting room waiting for an update from the doctor. The doctor didn't come straight to update them and did something else. The police get a record of anyone who dies in the hospital, and they feed that to the news, and the news had announced the death of this young man, and that was how his family had heard about it, sitting in the waiting room waiting for an update. So this is a devastating consequence of the rush of modern medicine. And we could say, well, I'm rushed, I'm busy. Or we could stop dead in our tracks and say, no, this is my job, and I need to learn how to do this well, and I need to know that these are the kinds of things that happen if I'm not paying attention to the fact that behind the patient on the operating table or in the emergency department is a story. It's a person with a family. It's a family that's waiting in the room. And it's my job to get straight to them, to let them know what's happened. I think we might also be confused then as people who might, when we're sitting at the desk, a month or a year or 2 years later, and someone comes up to the desk frantically several times looking for an update. And I might think, I said I would come back when the results were in. Why are they? I said I would come back. And not understanding the stories that people have been through, if I don't understand that, I might get frustrated by someone who comes up, again and again and again looking for information. Or I could remember that the kinds of things that might impact people are stories like this, where maybe in a time past they didn't get the information they needed in a time they needed it, and now feel so much anxiety that I might not be here to do my job well today. These are the kinds of things. How do we teach these things? Where is it in the medical school training in the language of science? How do we learn these things? This was another patient I took care of on July 4th in 2019. Came in, walked into the emergency department and said she didn't feel well. Was walking around, she just said she didn't feel well. And shortly after that, her son came into the room to get us to say that she looked strange. She was having a seizure. And we went in and the nurses said, oh, she must be having a seizure. And unfortunately, she wasn't having a seizure. She was having a massive cardiac event and then died from it. And we all came into the room. We worked for almost an hour and a half and were able to get the heart beating again. This will mean nothing to a non-medical audience, but this is something that in cardiac history is referred to as a tombstone event, because you'll see that in certain things, the leads look like a tombstone because it's an almost non-survivable event. Unless you have it sitting in the bed 4 of the Temple Emergency Department, this would be a non-survivable event. But it did happen to her in bed 4 of the Temple Emergency Department. We were able to restart the heart with the interventions we know how to do, get her to the operating room, unclog the heart. And about 6 months ago, she came in. I recognized the name immediately when I saw it pop up on the board, and she had some foot pain after running over her foot with a vacuum cleaner at home. I have never been so excited to see a patient in the emergency department in my entire life, because I had followed along knowing what a prolonged resuscitation we had. And she talked about how scary it was for her family, and her son was back with her again that day. And he talked about how scary it was when we said she was having a seizure, and how confusing it was, how confusing the events of the day were, and how fortunate we are to get to listen, to get to know both the medicine and the story, so we can think about how we might provide the best amount of care to families in desperate times of pain and need. So I also want to talk a little bit. So we have to pay close attention, because so she lived through the experience on July 4th in a few years ago, and another person came by. He was brought to us in the evening. He had been on the bus, on a SEPTA bus, and been found collapsed over. Came to us and was had died again had died from a massive cardiac event. And we found his wife through his work ID, and she came into the emergency department, and we told her, and we said we'd give her a few minutes with him, and we told her we'd come back if she had any questions. And I was called into the room, and they said, the wife is here, she has some questions. And I went in and I went back to talk to her, and she said, but what are we going to do on Christmas morning? So it's April. And all of us can imagine that when we talk about responses to trauma and responses to death, and you have some frantic arousal, and then you have numbness, and then you have very practical planning. And she was kind of having this practical planning, and but what am I going to do with the kids on Christmas morning? So medical school doesn't explain to me what I say to a woman when she asks me that. It doesn't help me, but literature does. Literature talks to me all about what happens to people, and literature talks to me about times of joy and times of deep sadness, and how to be with people, and how we might try to sit with someone as they grapple in these moments, sitting in our hospital room. So there's stories, there's 1,000-page epic stories, and then there's stories in a folded up piece of paper in someone's pocket. And so when people come into the emergency department and we don't know who they are, and we don't know how to find the people who care about them, sometimes we go through their pockets. And it's one other way that we put together a story about what's happened to people. And this was in the pocket of a man who had gone to the grocery store and had collapsed inside the grocery store, and we were looking to find his name, and he had his grocery list in his hand, in his pocket, folded up in his pocket. And that didn't help us locate his family, but it reminded us that he was a man walking to the grocery store looking for sour cream and onion dip. And anything that might have happened since, we needed to dial ourselves right back into the moment to communicate with him and his family. And a few weeks later, I was thinking about these things we find in people's pockets. And this young man came in, and he had died of a heroin overdose. We were getting ready to call his family. We found their number through a piece of paper, and another piece of paper in his pocket. He had shown up alone, and his mother was quite distraught about it. And when she came in, she said, "Did he have anything with him?" And we said, "Well, he had this little piece of paper." And it was this little piece of paper folded up in his pocket, and that was all we could give his mother about her son, who she hadn't seen in quite a while, as he had been lost to the streets of Kensington temporarily and now permanently. And we were able to share with her that somebody somewhere had written this note that her son had folded up and put in his pocket. And you could miss it. If I was just looking for his insurance card or his phone number, I could miss it. I could miss the actual story. And again, I'm here to make an argument in the most compelling way possible. And maybe I don't need to, because you've developed a health humanities minor, so somebody here already understands some of what I'm talking about. But if not, I'm here to make the argument in the strongest possible terms that we never forget, those of us interested in healthcare, ever forget who it is we're taking care of and what it is we would want if it was someone in my family laying in that bed, what I would want the person taking care of them to be thinking about, in addition to the dose of epinephrine they might need, and in addition to how many IVs they might need or how much fluid to put through it. I'd hope that they'd be thinking about some other things as well. And these are the kinds of things that in a life in medicine you come across routinely. And we don't need to have a talk on finding the meaning in medicine, as they sometimes ask me to give. The critical part is not losing it. The meaning is always there. The meaning in our profession is always there. The critical aspect is not to lose it. And how might we not lose the meaning that already exists as we move through life with our patients and their families? And this is, just in thinking about communication, and I don't need to tell that to this audience, but, we talk about it all the time. At the end of the day, people will not remember what you said or did. They will remember how you made them feel. And I think this is another place where literature teaches us, in many ways more than science could, about the job we have at hand. I want to talk a little bit also about why stories matter and why what we do matters. And this is Marsha Colby. Is anyone familiar with her story? She was a young woman who in around 2007 delivered her 6th child down in Alabama, and she delivered her child at home as she had all of her other children. That's her on the left, patient right, on the left of the screen, sitting with 2 of her older children. She delivered her 6th child. It was a stillbirth child, and she buried that baby in the yard. Her neighbors had noticed that she had been pregnant and was no longer pregnant, and notified the police, who exhumed the body. And a practitioner somewhere, after doing the autopsy, said he couldn't be 100% sure that the baby had never drawn a breath outside the body. And in his narration of the events that he found at autopsy, that was one of the lines he wrote, but the indication was that this baby was a stillbirth. I'm using the non-medical terms here, but that the baby was a stillbirth, had died prior to birth, and Marsha Colby was convicted to life in prison on the basis of the fact that she had, that there was possible that she had delivered a baby that was alive and that she had killed it. There's a lot more details to the story that are relevant, but that doctor then was one of the prime advocates, actually, in advocating for her release. She served quite a few years in prison, as you can see from her age as she gets out, but she got out of prison a few years ago after the doctor helped advocate and saying that the language he had used was a mischaracterization of the events, and that in a legal context, they were used in the wrong way. And the case is a little bit more complicated by that, but not much. Those of us who read the news would think, how could this possibly happen? But I think we know that things happen to people that aren't a reflection of the realities of their lives. And just being extra careful for those of us who go into fields where all the words matter. And medicine is certainly one of those fields, whether I'm talking to a patient or writing on a chart, absolutely all the words matter. But if I don't know how to use words, then I don't know what to do. And I think my liberal arts education provided me with this foundation of understanding how deeply words matter, and taught me how to use them as I would move through my career. I don't think that understanding narrative only helps patients. I think it also helps doctors. And this is a strange topic, although I think with COVID, we're getting to talk about it a little bit more, about the effect of being a doctor, effect of doctors on being a doctor. And it can be a little hard to talk about because I think sometimes still, not sometimes, a lot of times, I don't know that people always want their doctors to be so human. They don't want to know that their doctors are tired. They don't want your laundry to be dirty or, to have trouble getting into the office because you have childcare issues. Again, I think with COVID-19, this is changing a little bit. But I think that doctors whose brains are overwhelmed and undernourished run a real risk of taking bad care of patients and then of bringing those bad things home to their families. And so I also want to talk a little bit, not just about how understanding story helps patients, but how it also helps doctors. So my first year in training in 2013, a woman came in. She had a history of lung cancer. She was young. She was in her early 40s, and she had a history of lung cancer that had been treated. She came back in and had a cough. And so she was terrified. She was terrified about what this meant. And we took an x-ray and we took a CAT scan. And I went in to tell her the results, that it wasn't pneumonia, which was the thing that was on my mind. And she said, did they still see that spot? What happened with the spot? And to this day, I cannot tell you. It's 8 years later. I cannot tell you why I said what I said, but what I said was, oh, it hadn't changed. Now, she thought it had been gone. And what happened was I actually didn't know the answer to the question. And rather than saying, I'm so sorry, I don't know, let me go back and look, I made up something that I didn't know to be true. And I can't tell you why I did it. It was my first year out of training. I wanted to answer her question. And the minute I said it, she burst into tears. And I realized, I thought I was saying something comforting. And I realized I had just told a lie. I had lied. And not only did I lie, not comfort her, I told her the most devastating lie that I could have told her, which was that the spot that she was worried had not gone away was still there. I immediately realized what I did. I went out to tell people far senior to me, and they came back in and tried to talk to her. And we had lost a moment of trust. I had lost a moment of her trust. And I'd like to say that to my knowledge, I have not done it since. Anytime I don't know something and a patient asks me a question about their care and I don't know the answer, I'm not absolutely positive I remember the number of their potassium or the results of their CAT scan, I go check before I say anything. And I'm not afraid to say, I don't remember. I'm going to go check right now and I'll be right back in the room. I haven't done it since, but I did it this time. And I watch people behind me do it after me. And I say it just to say, I don't think you have to be a medicine to know that we make mistakes. And in medicine, our mistakes can have big consequences. This wasn't one of the ones that I might make that might have big immediate clinical consequences, but I broke a trust. I broke her trust in the medical system, and I certainly broke her trust in me. And so again, not only do I have to remember that all my words matter, but I have to remember that I might make mistakes, and I have to know how to face that. And medical school doesn't talk to you about that much either, but literature does. Literature talks to you about what happens when you make a mistake or something happens and you devastatingly regret the moment that has just passed and you just wish you could go back and you can't. And literature talks to you a little bit about that. Some of the books I like to read tell you a little bit about that and how that might work out and what you might do about it. Medical school traditionally does not. And I've watched mistakes weigh so heavy on the hearts of so many of us because, of course, none of us go into medicine to make a mistake and make someone cry or increase their pain. We go in for just the opposite reason. But sometimes by accident, we do something we don't intend. And we need to be very proficient in understanding what the impact of that is on that, not only on patients, but also on us. So this brings us back to this quote from my own country. The language of science could not begin to capture this phenomenon. The language of science did not begin to capture the heartache of the family, the tragic voyage of the patient, and my own grief at seeing this again and again. This is the board at Episcopal Hospital where I spend most of my time. Shortness of breath after a drug overdose, back pain, allergic reaction to a man using cocaine, drug overdose, an allergic reaction to a bee sting, suicide attempt in someone using drugs again after a period of 6 years of sobriety, drug overdose, drug and alcohol assessment, drug overdose, shoulder pain, and chest pain. Those are the patients that need to be seen in the hospital where I work. What do we do as doctors about this? What can we possibly do? These aren't rhetorical questions, I'm going to answer them, but I'm going to ask them first, and maybe you guys will have better ideas than we've been able to come up with. This is the ambulance bay at Temple Hospital. A stretcher sits outside around the clock because we know that in addition to being brought in by ambulance and police, men and women who've been shot get brought in, and we have a stretcher, and in the summertime we have 6 stretchers lying in wait because we have people that will come in all day and all night to get onto those, to be pulled out of their cars and get onto those stretchers. And we need to be able to get them in as fast as possible. So what might literature tell us, or what literature might we write about what it feels like to be a person in North Philadelphia or a doctor working where you need a whole parking space that might be filled with stretchers to take men and women in from the streets who are going to come in and be shot on your shift in the next 8 hours? The following photo was published in the New York Times. It's a photo from the inside of our hospital, and it's quite gory. It was published publicly, which is why I share it today. So this is what it looks like after we leave. How do we make sense of this as doctors? How do we make sense of it for our patients, for our families, for our staff? How do we make sense of the fact that some of us work and live in settings like this and others of us work and live in settings like this? And how do we help people understand what that might be like for our patients, for their families, and also for us? I say this because medical training, this is from the book, The Body Keeps the Score. I'm not sure if anyone's read it. But in it, he says, our entire training is geared towards staying calm during events unspeakable and confusing. And that's critically important. It's critically important that I stay calm 8 minutes before this photo was taken so that I can put in 2 chest tubes, put down a breathing tube, and get this person to the operating room, which is the only place that might save their life. It's incredibly important that I stay calm there. But I'm staying calm during events that are both unspeakable and confusing. So what do I do then? How do we help people come down in a normal and healthy way from these kinds of experiences? And I'll offer some answer. I don't have the answer, but I'll offer some answer about what it is we're trying to do at Temple. But these are the contexts in which we're thinking about these questions. It's not into the ether. It's in very real situations, day-to-day medicine. Certainly, I've showed you some of the more dramatic examples, but they're also not. This will happen if I were to go into work for the 5 p.m. shift today. These are the things that I would come across, and that the trainees that work alongside me would also come across. So we built a narrative medicine department at Temple. That's the one I work for. My boss is Mike Vitez. He came to us as a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for The Inquirer. He's not a doctor and therefore can access people in quite a different way. He's well beloved at our hospital because doctors are quite strange, as anyone who's been to one knows. So we're quite strange, and we don't know what to do with ourselves, and we don't know what to do with our jobs, and we don't know what to do with our feelings and our thoughts and all of the things that happen to us. And so we're trying to answer the question of how do we help people metabolize the things that happen to them. And we start with doctors and nurses first. We work with patients. We work with their families to really help people understand how to try to tell their own story as best they understand it in a given moment in time. A few examples, we had this, I don't know if anyone saw this in the Inquirer, but one answer we had was we had the first and second year medical students, in addition to studying the opiate pathways in the body and the effect of heroin and the effect of Narcan and the complications from long-term opiate use and the intensive care unit treatment of opiate withdrawal. We had them come into the hospital for 24 hours, one modeled after what the New York Times did during the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, where it was a day in the life of, they did the AIDS epidemic. We did a day in the life of the opiate epidemic, and we had the students come in with us, spread themselves all throughout the hospital at every hour of the day, and just look at the ways opiates were affecting patients. So some were with us in the emergency department watching opiate overdoses come through. Some were on the floors watching patients in pain and their doctors try to navigate how to treat pain in the setting of an opiate overdose for people, both opiate users and non-opiate users, learning how we distribute them out of our pharmacy. I mean, enormously complex questions that we tried to answer by just asking the students to come along with us and see what we see, and then write about it, and write what they saw, write what they understood from their level of training at the moment of time that they did it in, and see what they might tell us about the opiate epidemic. Something much more close to my heart, as I mentioned, I spent 3.5 years at Temple before I ever tried to write about the thing that I had seen hundreds of times, which was trying to tell parents that their children had died, mostly from gunshot wounds, as that's what many young people die from in the city and the place where I work. Incredibly an unusual event compared to other places in the country. Certainly the place where I come from, that would not be the leading cause of death for me. And so I tried to spend some time thinking about how I might write, and I read Jamaica Kincaid's piece, Girl, that was published in the New Yorker back in the 1970s. And with a teacher, I read very carefully these instructions of a mother to her daughter about how to be a woman, how to be a little girl who grew up to be a woman. And then the teacher said to me, okay, I was in a writing class, and she said, write instructions on how to do something you know how to do. And I spent some time, and I really metabolized this thing that had happened to me over the last 4 years, happened to many other people though, certainly also to me. And I tried to write about it as an event and as a moment in time, as a time capsule moment in time in the world that we live in. So we work with medical students, we work with faculty, we work with alumni, we work with patients, and we really try to take a piece of literature. We try to say that you can learn about opiates from studying opiate pathways, but you can also read the first 6 pages of Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin, and that might teach you anything more that you might ever need to know about what it feels like to be addicted to opiates or to be the brother of someone who is, or the loving family member of someone who is. And we argue that you need both. And so we study biochemistry, anatomy, physiology, intensive care medicine, emergency medicine, and then we study James Baldwin, and we see if with all of those things combined, could we possibly be the right kind of doctor to take care of people as they arrive to our hospital day to day. I know we have some students here, and I don't know that I don't know that age necessarily matters, but I also just want to talk a little bit about how we might find our path. And I know that I'll guess based on age who here is a student and who here isn't. But I'll speak to the room. And I know that for me, as a 21-year-old who liked reading books, I wondered where was my place in the world going to be? What was my job going to be? Where was I going to find myself? And I didn't know how to answer that question. And little things happened to me along the way that, again, if I wasn't paying attention to, I might have missed it, and I might not have ended up, for better or worse, where I find myself today. And I just wanted to talk about those because I think finding your path can be really hard, especially I think that there's great things being done here to try to merge seemingly disparate interests of health and the humanities into a cohesive field. And for that, I applaud you. It's quite forward thinking in the area as someone who studies what different institutions are doing to try to get at this. So building in a formalized program of study, I really applaud you. I think it's quite forward thinking. And so what are some events along the way that might teach us who we want to be and how we want to be? And I've touched on some that have happened since I started my training. This is my dad at Hopkins as a medical student in a bow tie, dissecting an anatomy lab without gloves on. Okay, so if we were in a visual arts class, we could really go deep in analyzing this photograph from the Johns Hopkins Anatomy Lab. And I grew up around stories because I grew up with a dad who was a scientist, who believes in the gospel of science, but who told us his story of how he got to be who he was. And what happened to him was he was training to be a surgeon in Boston. A man came in, he looked at the chart, and the man had been seen a few years earlier with a tumor in his belly. The surgeon took out what he could, closed the belly with tumor still in the belly, and said, limited prognosis, 2 months. And years later, my dad was seeing this person in the clinic in the Veterans Hospital in Massachusetts. And so he pulled the records, he felt all around the belly, saw the scar, thought, went back to the chart, same patient, same belly, went back to the lab, same patient, cancer cells, and came out. And this man had undergone one of the most unusual events in modern medicine, which was a spontaneous regression of a solid organ tumor. This led my dad on a path that has taken him through the next 53 years in the field of immunology. And that one interaction, seemingly benign with a patient across the room, reading through the chart, led him on this path that would take him all over the world through the depths of sciences and then out onto new frontiers of immunology, where, just a few years ago, his work was published, as it has been many times over, in really trying to answer this question of how do we harness the body's ability to fight cancer. And this isn't a made-up story. This is his story. This is the story I grew up with. I'll also say, as I went to residency interviews, this is Jan Schoenberger, who works out at University of Southern California. She asked all of us going into emergency medicine, who of you is interested in hyperbaric medicine? This is the hyperbaric chamber where you put people after they've been in a fire you give them extra oxygen to try. And she said, who's interested in hyperbaric medicine? No one raised their hand. She said, who's not interested in hyperbaric medicine? All of us raised our hand. And she said, well, how would you know? Have you ever done hyperbaric medicine? None of us had. Quite embarrassing. The point being, do you want to study health in the humanities? How would you know? Have you ever studied health in the humanities before? I'm not sure. So a huge lesson to me in where not to close my mind and where to just keep this wide open mind. Medical school gave me that opportunity. I got to study anything and everything I both wanted to study and didn't want to study. It was not up to me. And I got to just open my mind clearly to anything that might be a possibility. And for anyone who's still finding their way and feels a little bit confused about how that might happen, I would just encourage you to let your mind always be wide open and constantly be looking for where the next path for you might sprout up, because I don't think we all always know where that will be. I also want to say that this is the Katmai Peninsula in Alaska. And my sister and I share both the same mother and the same father. And I work in the emergency department in North Philadelphia. And she studies brown bears in the Katmai Peninsula. And that's her alarmingly close to a grizzly bear and then to many, many more. And she was really the first person who introduced me to a love of books and a love of learning. And she's here today. She surprised me for a visit from Alaska a few days ago. So I just wanted to say a public thank you to my oldest sister for really introducing me to a love of learning and a love of books. And that's where so many of us get this, I think, started in childhood. We get this love of books, love of learning, and where we might take it is absolutely open. As I said, I put in chest tubes, and she carries a shotgun in the Katmai Peninsula, and both of us come from the same family reading books. So for those of us involved in educating the next generation, I think a love of teaching, a love of books, and a love of learning can't be overstated. I leave you with that, and also this poem by a Japanese poet who says, "Poems hide in the bottom of our shoes, they are sleeping. They are the shadows drifting across our ceilings the moment before we wake up. What we have to do is live in a way that lets us find them." Thanks, everyone. Thanks for letting me be here. Any questions? Does anyone have any questions? The question was, do I find that my colleagues are open to the, no. What I find though, I happen to have a chair who, while he might not be interested himself in the things we're interested in, he lets us pursue our own paths. And so we did our first writing workshop with the emergency medicine faculty. One of the senior faculty walked in and said, "I haven't looked under the hood in 40 years and I'm doing just fine." And I said, "Thank you, sir." It's my senior project, but no pressure, sitting among senior physicians. And, we always ask at the end of a writing session, who enjoyed that? Some people raise their hand. Who hated it? Some people raise their hand. And then we say, who thought they were going to hate it but actually enjoyed it? And those are the people where we're surprised a little bit. I think so, so many of us are so afraid of the things we don't know, and we don't know how to do well, certainly, and the things we perceive we might not like. But I've been lucky at Temple. Temple believes and understands that we have a big job to do, and that we can't afford to say we know how to do it well, and we need to be willing to open ourselves to all paths. So I've been pretty lucky in terms of being allowed to find the people who find us, and then occasionally being part of required sessions for different groups. But they've been quite kind, and the program grows and not shrinks, so we must be doing something that somebody kind of finds some value in. It's a hard sell. Yeah. Yes?
You spoke about how you were writing your text and thinking about being a doctor. What is your expertise in medicine as effective in the way you write?
So the question was that I talked about how being a doctor affects, How has being a physician changed my writing? Absolutely. I mean, I walk myself into a room not knowing what's coming at me, which is much like sitting at a blank page. You don't exactly know what might move through you or what might come out. I think that being a doctor, I didn't know that I had very much to say. And I think that the longer I spend practicing medicine, the more I realize that the world is actually quite hungry for understanding some of what happens to people. And the emergency department is a great, you see everything that happens to people at the door of the emergency department. We're open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And so I think I bring that to it. I also bring an ability to be quite impatient and in a rush and to write quickly. So I think, we train in a very specific way in the emergency department to make big decisions based on limited information in a fast period of time. And writing can feel like that, or it can feel like something where you get hours and days and weeks to pore over one idea. So in some ways it feels quite similar, and in some ways it doesn't. But I really enjoy asking doctors to write about the thing they think about the most, because each of us is constantly, for me, it's how to break bad news and how to be with people in times of bad news. And any doctor I come across finds things that again and again in their career, they just find themselves thinking about. And those are the things I really encourage us to write through and think through, because maybe we would have something that we could share that would instruct other people about what it is that we do. Yeah.
You're in a unique situation as an emergency physician because you're not really going to see patients after they are somebody else. And so it's interesting to me that it comes up for you over and over again. It's how to break barriers to the family. But that seems in a way that it keep you sort of more humanly in touch than some other doctors who are constantly caring for the same patients for a longer period of time. And they sort of, I guess what is it, not hard, because have to be kind of efficient and move through their business. So I was wondering, when you're running your classes, do you find that the other doctors are using that to recover their ability for their patients? Do you see that, is that something that's identified as an issue or a problem or now?
Yeah, I think we make an argument about burnout for the work that we do. I read Sonny's Blues with the Psychiatrists a few weeks ago, and I was shocked at they had the exact opposite reaction to both Sonny and his brother as any class I'd ever talked to. And they realized themselves in the course of the hour how hardened they had become to seeing people. These were the psychiatrists in our crisis center, which sees the bulk of the living seeking drug treatments in a hospital setting in North Philadelphia. And they realized in reading the story of Sonny and his brother that they themselves had become quite hardened is one word. I really saw it as kind of actually a traumatized brain, and I don't want to overuse or not think through using that word. But I went into emergency medicine, and they said the great thing about emergency medicine is it's shift work. You never have to take anything home with you. Man, were they wrong. They were wrong. I don't run a practice and I don't keep my own schedule for the next day, but there might be no specialty that takes home what happens to people more than mine. And so sometimes these little assumptions we have about different specialties or different ways of being turn out the exact opposite. But we do spend a fair bit of our time, there's what we call the patient-facing specialties, meaning specialties that interact with patients. And then there's doctors who might work in a radiology lab reading x-rays. And we spend quite a bit of our time with the, now in the common parlance, frontline workers of the intensive care unit, emergency department, and then the day-to-day clinic, really trying to think of ways to not be in too much of a rush, to not be in so much of a rush for our family care doctors or our internists that you really miss the thing that we were put on the earth to do, which is to see people, be with them in times of sickness, injury, pain, illness, healing, joy. And we think through this a lot, both in the specialties like mine, where you might have 5 or 10 seconds to establish rapport with a patient or their family, and in specialties like family medicine, where you might know a family over decades and the different situations you might find yourself in there. So, great. Great. I want to thank everyone for coming out today. It's so nice to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again to everyone for being here, and especially thank you to Naomi and Beth for joining today in support. Okay. Have a good afternoon, everyone.